I didn't become a victim of a false allegation when it happened to me. I became another recruit in the war against it.
My family and my name have been totally and permanently destroyed.
Is morphing into a witch hunt.
Always be presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty.
Okay, in this video, I read for you a signed and notarized affidavit of facts written by convicted sex offender Dennis John McKenna on 30 November 2017, while he was incarcerated in Acacia Prison, Western Australia. Western Australians will know his name well. McKenna had at one time been labeled West Australia's worst pedophile. He had been previously tried and convicted by jury in the early 1990s for sexual assault of minors that had occurred while he was a warden at St. Andrew's Hostel in Kattanning, WA, between 1975 and 1980. After McKenna's release from prison, and having participated in all required rehab programs, McKenna went on to live in the Australian community for around 20 years without the slightest incident. I am making this video now primarily for two reasons. First, McKenna and my involvement in his case while in prison, as well as with his father, the late Doug McKenna, is recounted throughout my journals, which I will begin reading verbatim this month in a separate Salem's Ghost series called Journals from the Prison Years, 2011 to 2017. The second reason for making this video now is that in producing his affidavit of facts regarding his case, it was McKenna's request and hope that his affidavit would be made public, and he had entrusted me with that task just prior to my release and deportation back to the United States. I have both McKenna's typed and handwritten affidavits in my possession, both of them signed and notarized by a justice of the peace, as well as having McKenna's express permission to publish them. As you will hear in his affidavit, back in 2010, Dennis McKenna had been resurrected, as it were, for the sole purpose of being used as a scapegoat to jumpstart the controversial Redress Scheme in Western Australia under the Barnet government. This scheme was the forerunner to what would eventually become the National Redress Scheme, at last enacted in 2018. It was with the McKenna Redress campaign and the hype and hysteria generated by Channel 7 and the West Australia newspaper that, in my view, had officially launched the war on men and the patriarchy, which has since spread throughout the Western world. But before I comment further, I will play my audio reading of McKenna's affidavit of facts. If you should wish to follow along with the text or save a copy of this affidavit, I have provided a link below to a scanned copy of the actual typed, signed, and notarized affidavit. Here now is my verbatim reading of the affidavit of facts of Dennis John McKenna, which he had signed and notarized on 30 November 2017.
Affidavit of Facts of Dennis John McKenna. I, Dennis John McKenna, currently a prisoner at Acacia Prison, Great Eastern Highway, Warraloo, in the state of Western Australia, being duly sworn, make oath as follows. I am the creator of this affidavit. I was born in the state of Western Australia. My date of birth is 6 February 1945. I am 72 years old at the time of preparing this affidavit. The facts contained in this affidavit are, except where expressly stated to the contrary, within my personal knowledge and belief, and are both true and correct. Where matters contained in this affidavit are outside my personal knowledge, I believe them to be true and have identified the source of my information and belief. On the event of being charged with 66 counts of sexual behavior, I engaged lawyer Patty Chung to represent me. During 3 separate recorded phone discussions via prison phone, I told Patty Chung on each occasion that I could not plead guilty to the many charges made by my alleged victims. The acts I was being charged for simply did not occur. I also learned from family and others on the outside of the time that people were being encouraged to jump on the redress bandwagon for the money. All they needed to do was make a statement for police. This was being encouraged on Facebook accounts and other websites belonging to the original accusers. I routinely instructed Patty Chung to secure prints of the Facebook comments, but she refused to do so. The initial charges, being 14 charges, had been made by 5 men. About a year later, an additional 16 charges were laid against me, as more people jumped on the Redress Express. In late 2012, while at Acacia Prison, I met a fellow prisoner named John Victor Ramses, an American. I was distraught and overwhelmed then, due primarily to the almost daily negative media attention from 7 West and the West Australian newspaper, and was getting no real help from my lawyer. Mr. Ramses offered to assist me in what way he could by helping me prepare a response to the charges by recording a plea to each charge in writing. He also assisted me in preparing faxes and writing related letters to Patty Chung. In my response, I pleaded guilty to those acts of which I actually committed some 20 years prior. I pleaded not guilty to those I did not do. Mr. Ramses prepared and typed my response accordingly, which I faxed to Patty Chung. Patty Chung only made one in-person visit to me while in prison to discuss my case. During that meeting, Miss Chung informed me that if she was going to represent me, I had to plead guilty to all charges. Miss Chung also informed me that the Department of Public Prosecutions had insisted that all 16 alleged victims must be included. This, despite the fact that some of these accusers were never at the hostel during that era, and were obviously making false statements, which could have been proven if Patty Chung had followed my instructions to secure that evidence. Patty Chung was less pleased that I would not simply plead guilty to all charges, as per the DPP's insistence. She gave me the impression that she was actually on the side of the DPP and not truly interested in representing me. My case was deliberately extremely high profile in the media, and I felt that Patty Chung had taken my case only for publicity on herself. Nonetheless, I informed Patty Chung that I intended to maintain my pleas with respect to the document I had prepared regarding the charges, and that I could not plead guilty to acts I did not commit. Sometime later, before sentencing, I met with a psychologist who had been instructed to make a pre-sentencing assessment on me for court. The psychological evaluation was requested by Patty Chung with my approval. During this assessment meeting, the psychologist said to me, "Dennis, are you aware that the charges have been changed?" She told me that additional charges of carnal knowledge and penetration had been included. I was not aware of this and had not been told. I became quite upset. I felt that the DPP had made up those charges to punish me for not pleading guilty to the other charges, including all 16 accusers, as they had insisted I do. The psychologist advised me that I must get a copy of the new charges to review and address because they were significantly damning. Again, with the help of Mr. Ramses, we prepared a fax to Patty Chung. In that fax, I explained what the psychologist had told me, and that I demanded to see the charge sheet, as was my right. In a follow-up phone call recorded, Patty Chung informed me that the changes are trivial, and nothing significantly new had been added. Carnal knowledge is not a trivial matter. Moreover, Patty Chung refused to provide me with a copy of the changed charge sheet, regardless of how trivial in her mind the changes were. I was not given any opportunity to review the charges, nor to address them with any plea. Patty Chung simply refused my request to see the charge sheet. During the sentencing hearing in late January 2013, highly anticipated by the media, the charges, about 32 to 34, were read aloud in a public court. When the charges of carnal knowledge were read out, which I had never been given an opportunity to review, I made challenge to them, stating that I had not pleaded guilty to any such charge. The sentencing judge sternly told me, "Mr. McKenna, you pleaded guilty to these charges and will be sentenced on the plea of guilty." I was effectively shut down and silenced before the crowd of public onlookers and media, including alleged victims. I was unlawfully sentenced on those charges I had never seen nor pleaded to, but which acts had never occurred. These charges had been fabricated by the DPP in order, I believe, to provide media with a big bang after such a long and costly media campaign against me and my brothers to jumpstart the redress scheme for the Barnet government. I had been told by the arresting officer at the time of arrest that I had been selected to jumpstart redress due to prior convictions on sexual offenses, and that because of those convictions 20-some years prior, the public would easily believe that I am guilty regardless of the evidence. I was deeply appalled by this and knew then that I, and subsequently my brothers, were merely expendable assets to promote a questionable scheme and agenda. I therefore state here and now in this affidavit that I never pleaded guilty to those charges of carnal knowledge, which caused a lengthy sentence, nor to many of the other charges. The pleas provided to the sentencing judge were deliberately falsified by the DPP, knowing that I had no help or support, not even from my own counsel. The public had been grossly lied to. The DPP merely wanted to close out the McKenna Kattanning circus, Patty Chong's description, with a bang ahead of the elections in March. The state of WA, namely the DPP, cannot provide any proof whatsoever that I ever pleaded guilty to said charges. No signed confession, no video confession. Moreover, when a confession is being made, it must be recorded on video as per legislation, Section 118 of the Criminal Investigation Act of Western Australia. No confession in any form was ever made by me to the said charges of carnal knowledge. The DPP should, however, have a copy of my typed pleas that I had provided to Patty Chung. A subsequent attempt to appeal the sentence through lawyer Simon Waters was immediately met with an onslaught of negative media, as if orchestrated to put pressure on the judges to dismiss the appeal, which they did do. I have since made exhaustive inquiries into the name of the psychologist who first informed me of the changes to the charge sheet, but have been completely ignored. Naturally, pursuit of this case to a high court would open a nasty can of worms. But it hopefully will be pursued in time. The public were lied to, and as a result, it cost the taxpayer tremendously. If I was used to start this draconian redress scheme, which has since seen hundreds of men wrongly imprisoned on an accusation alone, costing taxpayers millions in compensation and payouts to alleged victims, I feel I must do whatever I can to set the record straight. I am hopeful that some media outlet or journalist with integrity like the ABC would investigate this case and this entire redress scheme that is costing public taxpayers millions of dollars and putting hundreds of innocent men in prison. Sworn by the said Dennis John McKenna at Acacia Prison, Woolloomooloo, in the state of Western Australia, on 30/11/2017. Before the Justice of the Peace, number 8504, Western Australia, on 30/11/2017.
Okay, right from the start, I want to clear something up. You heard me read that McKenna hoped some media outlet or journalist with integrity, like the ABC, would investigate. McKenna was referring to the ABC, or the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, as it had once been before they sold out their integrity to the PC culture and radical leftist ideals. Today, in my view, the ABC Australia is no more than a leftist propaganda machine where facts are irrelevant and integrity is nil. ABC Australia has become no different than CNN or MSNBC. And moreover, while ethical and professional journalists still do exist in Australia, they live in fear of being raided by authorities in what has now become an authoritarian Australia, and will likely not pursue any worthy stories, as would be the McKenna case. McKenna was the first of many prisoners I would come to help with legal matters during my 6.5 years at Acacia Prison. And it was while helping McKenna, whereby becoming a thorn in the state's ass, that I began to receive idle threats on my life, passed through prison guards, with comments such as, "You've already had a heart attack this year. No one would question if you suddenly died of another one," as well as being subjected to various punishments for helping McKenna and other prisoners. 2013 had been an election year in WA, and the McKenna case had been extremely important to the Barnet government. Millions of dollars had been spent on propaganda in the local media, and McKenna's conviction was all but wrapped up and tied with pretty ribbons, making Barnet look just peachy. Then, some Yankee convict come from out of nowhere, poised to screw it all up for them by giving McKenna advice and encouraging him to plead guilty only to what crimes he actually did commit some 30 years ago. Gary Adshead of the West Australia newspaper was chief propagandist during the McKenna fiasco. Immediately following McKenna's sentencing hearing in February 2013, Adshead switched roles from chief legal editor to chief political editor in time to ensure Barnet won the election. Adshead had published a number of ludicrous, outrageous claims in order to thoroughly demonize McKenna in the public's mind. I had my own dealings with Adshead, and he is, in my opinion, among the most deceitful, unscrupulous reporters in the Southern Hemisphere, and that's saying something. Adshead enjoyed preying on Dennis's aged father, Doug McKenna, who was at the time ill and alone, and by then in his 80s, suffering from certain mental ailments common to his age. Adshead took advantage of that, pretending to be on Doug's side, only wanting to tell the facts, when the opposite was true. Adshead simply gained Doug's trust in order to weasel out of him and then misrepresent the facts to make the whole McKenna family look bad. Dennis's mother had been placed in a care facility some years prior due to encroaching Alzheimer's, which only worsened with time. Protected in the care facility, Dennis's mother had been oblivious to the trauma and devastation her sons were experiencing amidst baseless accusations and widespread publicity. I'd often assured Dennis that in this instance, his mother's Alzheimer's seemed to be a gift from God to protect her heart from having to endure the witch hunt that had accused 3 of her 4 sons and put 2 of them in prison. Both Neil and Wayne were wrongly convicted in my view, having been privy to certain details through my involvement with Dennis McKenna and his father Doug. But that's another video. So why was McKenna selected to jumpstart redress in Western Australia? The answer is simple if you know history and the manufacturing of hysteria to serve political agendas. During the age of witch trials, in order to initiate hysteria that would ultimately lead to hundreds being accused and arrested, it was a common practice for the witch finders to pick out some hapless person in a remote community, whom the general public would harbor little doubt in believing them to be a witch. The targeted persons were often social outcasts and the elderly, primarily women, who lived alone and had no family or friends to champion her. Such people were selected first in order to get the snowball rolling. But often these people were just scapegoats, used to jumpstart the hysteria. The real targets of the agendas were those in more esteemed social positions, whom the church, at the time, wanted removed due to a conflict of political or religious beliefs, or to have cause to confiscate their lucrative assets. Nothing has changed today. The same tactic is being used to incite public hysteria regarding sex offenses, Police, lawyers, judges have all adopted the witch trial presumption that the accused person is guilty until proven innocent, and that innocence is rarely ever proven. In a nutshell, today's accused sex offender is the new witch. The mere accusation has been weaponized to serve a similar agenda as once served the Roman Catholic Church of old. But I digress. Once the hapless person had been labeled a witch, it caused a snowball effect. People were then incited by local criers or the reporters of the day into a torch and pitchfork frenzy, eager to punish the accused, blaming him or her for all their personal woes. The authorities drooled at this effect because they knew it was only a matter of time before the public would begin accusing each other, leading to the intended mass arrests on a mere accusation alone. There is always a political agenda behind witch hunts, and the Roman Catholic Church of the era knew well the nature of uneducated, superstitious people. Before long, everyone was accusing everyone else of being a witch, the medieval version of Me Too, falling right into the hands of the authority who desired to crush dissent or slightest opposition against the church. Moreover, certain groups of seemingly average community members were organized and paid to shame those who didn't rally behind the notion that accusers never lie. The very same tactic is used today to generate hysteria over alleged sex offenses to push an agenda that might otherwise be met with public resistance, without a common cause to unite them. Almost everyone hates child abusers as much as the public had once hated witches. And people today are just as naive and gullible, if not as vindictive and self-righteous, as they were several hundred years ago. Quite deservingly, many of those self-righteous and pompous individuals who took up the torch and pitchfork against a merely accused very often became accused themselves. They themselves had been used as mere tools by the establishment, but naturally were only expendable assets. The same has occurred today, where those who publicly lambasted a merely accused sex offender also wound up being accused. So the point here is that certain persons are targeted due to the believability of an offense by the simple-minded lay public. Thus, McKenna had been selected by the state of WA due to having been previously convicted on sexual charges. The government knew that the lay public would easily accept that he had committed the crimes as accused without one shred of evidence to support it. But to ensure this outcome, McKenna's face and horror story was paraded daily across WA's Channel 7 and across the front page of the West Australian newspaper, where Gary Add's head picture and name were ever present with the article. There can be no doubt that some group of powerful politicians held private meetings to determine who would be the best prey to jumpstart their redress scheme. It should be unnerving to every rational person that right now someone may be conspiring against even you or a loved one in this reckless age of weaponized accusations. Perhaps especially if you're a conservative or a Christian, or just in the way of someone's ambitions of advancement. To add more meat to this draconian redress campaign, Dennis McKenna's two brothers, Wayne and Neil, were also accused of committing sexual crimes. Clearly fabricated claims in my eyes. An entire family had been destroyed just to push the redress agenda, which ultimately blew up into a deliberate and well-planned war against men and male-oriented institutions. This all took place during the reign of Julia Gillard, a close friend and supporter of Hillary Clinton, who I've long maintained orchestrated the coup against Kevin Rudd that installed Gillard in mid-2010. Gillard would, shortly after her rise to Prime Minister, deliver a scathing Clinton-style condemnation of men in Parliament, which Clinton had applauded from America. Gillard would later authorize the Royal Commission into institutional sex abuse that would ultimately affect every traditionally male-oriented institution in Australia, both secular and religious, and would ultimately see the likes of George Pell accused and convicted on nothing more than a provably bogus accusation. Gillard, in my view, had been installed by Clinton in part to jumpstart the war against men and the patriarch in Australia. It's no secret how Hillary feels about men and the patriarchy. The snowball effect of that redress campaign against the new witch, the merely accused sex offender, had its origin in West Australia, a remote, isolated metropolis that most of the world had never heard of prior. And Dennis John McKenna had been used as a scapegoat to jumpstart it all. I know because I was there, in prison, with McKenna. The public never knows the facts behind any case put to trial, nor the abject corruption behind the scenes, unless you go through it. The media will certainly never report it. In closing, McKenna wanted these facts to be known. He also expressed to me that he wanted to sincerely apologize to his brothers Neil and Wayne, who were and are innocent, but who became scapegoats or otherwise expendable assets to add additional punch for justifying the redress agenda. McKenna feels that it was with his case and the push for the redress scheme that paved the way for all male-run institutions to ultimately come under attack, including the traditional family. I am John Victor Ramses, and this is Salem's Ghost. And, as always, if you know my daughter, tell her I love her, and that I never left her. Her daddy was taken. Thanks for watching.